again. Listen, this has been a while since I've had Robert Spencer on board, and there's a reason why I have him here. There's a reason I've asked him to dress up, put his tie on and his nice suit coat and smile like he always does in his amazing office. All those books he says he's read, but it's because he's so well read that he's doing what he's doing now, and that is pouring out book after book, volume after volume on very controversial material. But probably the most controversial is the one that came out back in 2012. As you can see by the title, Did Muhammad Exist? Probably the first one to ask this question publicly. Others have hinted at it, many have talked about it behind closed doors, but no one was willing to actually publish this question until Robert did that back in 2012. Welcome, Robert. Good to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Jay. Always good to talk to you.
Now, today is a special day because this is what you did back in 2012. That we're talking about 9 years ago. Something has happened that actually has triggered a complete new edition. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. And it's out today. The revised and considerably expanded edition, Did Muhammad Exist? You've got it right there. That's it. That's the one.
So I have a pre-publication one. I've got one of the first off the press. You sent it to me immediately so that I could read it and actually have it on hand so that we could really push it today. Because today is the day, the 13th of July is the day it is now available to all of you.
In the spirit of al-Nasikh wal-Mansukh, the one you're holding in your left hand is now abrogated.
This has been abrogated. Okay, we'll throw it away because
yes,
this has so much more, doesn't it?
Yes, 25% more new material, new discoveries since I wrote the first one, new things that I've found, more information about some of the things that were already there, some of the critics answered who objected to the first edition, all kinds of new things in the new edition.
Exactly. And that's, I mean, I was just looking at the table of contents and I noticed that you've added two complete new chapters. Chapter 6, The Absence of Arabia, and Chapter 9, Which Quran? Those are not in the original one. You've kept to all the other chapters, but I noticed that in every chapter there are more pages. What's going on here? Tell me, help us.
You take, for example, the Switching on the Full Light of History, Chapter 5. That is a survey of some of the early historians of Islam, that is the people who tell us what Muhammad said and did, the Islamic texts. I'm sorry, is that chapter 4 or chapter 5? Let me make sure.
That's chapter 5, Switching on the Full Light of History.
Yes, that's right. And so I wanted to, in the old edition, I speak about Ibn Ishaq, who is the earliest biographer of Muhammad, whose work that we have today. Of course, we only have it in the recension of Ibn Hisham, from the early 9th century, which is 200 years after Muhammad is supposed to have died. And so that is, I think, a very important yawning gap about which much has been made. You have spoken about it, many others have spoken about it, that there is just no indication of the existence of any of the texts that make up the Sirat Rasulullah, the biography of the Prophet of Allah, before the 9th century. But there are historians, Scholer and others, who actually say, well, we have 7th century historians who speak about Muhammad. And what they never tell you is that, yes, we have 7th century historians who speak about Muhammad, and we have their writings from 9th century copies. So even those are all 9th century material. We cannot be sure that they have not been altered, tampered with in all kinds of ways. So I go back through the earliest historians now in the new edition, such as Urwa ibn az-Zubair and what's the other one? Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, many others who were not mentioned in the first edition, but historians actually point to them. Scholer, Gregor Scholer likes to say that az-Zubair got his material straight from his aunt Aisha. And he's basing that, however, on isnad chains, that is chains of transmission of these traditions about Muhammad that only come to us from 200 years later. And so the idea that this is some sort of material from eyewitnesses is completely false and baseless. And it's kind of odd to see an academic working that way. You would never find academics in the fields of Christianity or Judaism or any other religion being so careless with the historical record.
I think this is something that needs to be brought up, and you've done a great job on that. But in both editions, the abrogated edition and the new one coming out today, and that is there is a double standard here. There has always been a double standard with Islam. It's as if no one wants to say anything critical of Islam. They're holding this material and they're holding with gloves on their hands because they do not want to burn themselves because it's so difficult to actually say what you know. Fascinating. How many scholars have you talked to? Have I talked to? When you ask them in private, what are they finding? They will tell you one story, but when you ask them, what do they say in public? It's a completely different story. They're censoring themselves because of this reticence to go public with what they know. You don't do that though, because you're taking their material, which they have to publish, they have to write. You're taking it and you're actually getting it out in the public sphere where it is needed. That's why I want to thank you for what you're doing. But you've done something that's fascinating because you've asked the question that every historian should ask. And that is, if you're going to depend on these 9th and 10th century traditions to create that story that exists, those 9th and 10th century writings are all from people who lived up in Baghdad, hundreds of miles north, and lived hundreds of years later. So too far north and too late. If you're a good historian, you should always go back to the 7th century, the time period. And you say that in your introduction. You need to go back and see what was happening on the ground. You need to go back and see who was living, who was saying things, who was actually moving, and what were they saying, and what were they doing, and what was happening politically. And when you look at that scenario in the 7th century, it does not at all parallel what you're reading in the 9th and 10th century. They get the wrong places, they get the wrong people, they get the wrong events, they get the wrong names. On almost every case, they make error after error, historical anachronism. And what's most interesting, the people they're quoting, we are able to find in the 7th century, but they don't live anywhere near Mecca or Medina. They live way up in Hira. They live in a place called Ctesiphon, which is later become Baghdad. Hira becomes Kufa. They live in Damascus. And now what we're finding, most of this material comes out of Jerusalem. It comes out of Israel. Well, why are we surprised suddenly when you come up and say, well, did this man even exist? What a huge thing to say. It should be something that everybody should be saying. Did Muhammad even exist? Did Mecca ever exist? Did the Quran ever exist in the 7th century? In the 8th and 9th century, you start to see it. By the 9th century, it's almost complete. But that, as you have mentioned, is 200 years too late. And you are the first one to write it. And what I would suggest is that everybody get a copy of this book. You need to start with this book because this is the foundation that will open it up. Now, what you have done is you have only quoted source material from the 7th and 8th century. You're only quoting scholars who have gone back there and have dug up the coins, who have dug up the rock inscriptions, who have looked at the buildings, who have looked at what little manuscripts exist, even the ones that you're referring to, like the Doctrina Iacobi. You're also referring to Sophronius. You're talking about the Sabaeus and his writing, his chronicles. You're also talking about Thomas the Presbyter, who are writing in the 7th century, but their manuscripts don't appear until the 9th century. You could even go both ways with that, Robert, because even if you take them at what they're saying, look and see what they say about this Muhammad. He is not the Muhammad of the 9th century. First of all, right. He was born in Hira. He's a Christian. He becomes a Christian after he attacks Jerusalem, and Sophronius offers him to go and pray there in the Church of the Sepulchre. He refuses to do that. He goes right to the Temple Mount and puts a structure there. But it's because of his relationship with the Christians, he then turns to Christianity. This is not the Muhammad of Islam. And it's not even the right name. His name is Umar. However, his nickname is Muhammad. Bingo. Now, that's something we're just finding out now. And that's why I would suggest you're going to have to write a book every year.
Okay.
I would suggest, and I'm putting this forward, why don't you update this every year? Because there is so much new material, even coming in 2021. It's going to continue in 2022.
Well, I'll tell you, Jay, I'd have to interest a publisher in doing that. And I don't know if that's possible. We'll see. But on the other hand, one can always write another book. I have written actually one book a year since 2000, and actually more than that. And I'd be happy to take up some of these new discoveries in a new book altogether. But you know something, you said so much there. and I did want to comment on a couple things. One is that scholars have not gone to this, even when their own conclusions lead them to where we are and what we're discussing now. And I think that's one of the most telling failures of academia today, that they're not guided by wherever the truth may lead them, but they're guided by political considerations, cultural considerations, and all the other considerations that have nothing to do with academic inquiry. And that actually is in the book also, because in this edition, not in the first edition, is a discussion of the pioneering work of Dan Gibson that you have discussed at great length, and we've discussed before in earlier videos, his discoveries that the earliest mosques don't face Mecca at all, but face Petra in southern Jordan, which is noteworthy, as I note in the book, because the Quran is not written in the Arabic of southwestern Arabia where Mecca is, but the Arabic of the Nabateans where Petra is. Yeah. And not only that, but the mosques pointing to that area, Petra of the Nabateans, indicates, it coincides with a lot of what you were just outlining about how all this takes place farther north than it is represented to be taking place, than the places where it is represented to be happening. But the thing is that that kind of discovery has been met not with academic refutation at all.
Yeah.
And I found it most remarkable when I was adding the material from Gibson into this new edition, that David King, who purports to refute Gibson's findings about the Qibla, he actually doesn't do so. What he does is he says that Gibson is Islamophobic.
Yeah.
And I think that has no place in there it is. That's David King's writing on Gibson's discoveries. And nowhere does David King prove that the early mosques don't face Petra. He just says Gibson's Islamophobic.
Credential, does not have a doctorate, did not study under me. Therefore, why are you listening to him? You need to listen to me. I've only been to one mosque in my whole life. I spent all my time in a library reading 9th, 10th, 11th century scholars, whereas Dan Gibson went to every mosque, over 100, physically went there and got the measurements. Now, why didn't David King do that?
And exactly. And in the same vein, I found a review that is also quoted in the book of, I believe it's Hagarism, the pioneering work by Patricia Crona and Michael Cook about the origins of Islam, and the scathing review in an academic journal that essentially the argument against the book boiled down to, this is negative toward Islam. Yeah. And I think this is what academics are worried about now, making Islam look bad or reflecting positions that they think make Islam appear in a negative light. That should never be an academic consideration. Yeah. Academics should be concerned with what's true and what isn't, not with what's so-called Islamophobic or what portrays Islam negatively. But that has stymied a lot of research in this area because academics today are afraid of appearing to be Islamophobic, this trumped up propaganda word that has no actual content, or they're afraid that they will be going against the mainstream, like Shabir Ali in his The Islamic Apologist, in his video refutation of the first edition of Did Muhammad Exist. He spends most of his time explaining that I'm relying on fringe scholars, whereas the mainstream scholars disagree, which is just like saying I'm relying on the red scholars, whereas the blue scholars say something else. It doesn't tell us anything about whether the mainstream scholars are right and the fringe ones wrong, or vice versa. It's just name calling.
Let me just say something about that. Even when I was studying this, when I did my first debate in 1995 against Dr. Jamal Badawi at Cambridge University, I went up to Patricia Crona to her office, and I got the 10 major challenges. She was the one that actually helped me with the 10 major challenges. She was so good, and as she kept on going, try this, don't use this, here's something better, have you looked, say it this way. And I turned to her and I said, why aren't you doing this debate? And she just laughed at me. She says, Jay, don't you realize I have a chair to protect? I have an institution that I represent. I cannot do what you're doing. And this is probably one of the most provocative of all the scholars, telling me that she can't even debate this. She is not permitted to because of the institution, Cambridge University, that she has to represent. And as I realized that the penny dropped, that was back in 1995 when she told me that. And the penny dropped when I realized we have a freedom. You and I have a freedom that the others don't. We can take the fringe scholars who are much more numerous than those who are in academia, because the fringe scholars do not have these restrictions that the academic scholars who have a chair to protect, who have a tenure to protect, who have their salary to protect, and who also need to get into these countries to be able to continue their research. If they ever say anything publicly, that will shut them down. They won't get the visas. They won't be able to get to their research. And that's why, in some ways, what we're finding is going beyond. The other thing that came up, and that was, you're using an awful lot of material. Like, I mean, you have not just confronted Muhammad, you're also confronting the Quran in this book.
Yeah.
You're doing two things at once, folks. It's not just Muhammad he's confronting. He's also confronting, did the Quran exist? You could put that as a subtext. What you're doing with the Quran is all the newest material that's now been coming out in the last 10 years, since 2012. And enormous material has been coming out. Some of that you're quoting this guy here, Luxemburg, and you're quoting Dr. Gunther Lulling. These two guys who have almost overturned academia by saying, why is it no one's looked at the Quran itself and seen where it is borrowed from? Because much of the Quran is borrowed from other sources. Go back to those other sources and you will see most of them are Syro-Aramaic. They are Syro-Aramaic, and they're not just anything. These are Christian hymns that were written in the 5th and 6th century in Syriac, but you've got to read them in Syriac to understand what they mean. That's why so much of the Quran today, 20% of the Quran today, the Muslim scholars don't understand, because they're not going back to the antecedents of where they're borrowed from. Now, you do talk about the Birmingham Folio, and this was something that a lot of people have thrown at you. Because of the fact that people even emailed you and said, now you're going to have to throw away that book that you published in 2012, because in 2015, the Birmingham Folio was finally discovered. I love how you responded to that. Go ahead and explain how you respond to that, because people are saying, if we can find one object, if we can find one manuscript, if we can find one reference to Muhammad prior to 690, it destroys everything you have said in your book, in this book. How did you respond to the Birmingham Folio, which seemed to suggest it does predate not only the 690, but it also covers the life of Muhammad himself, 568 to 645?
Well, that's the problem with it right there, Jay, of course, that, let me say first that in case anybody doesn't know, the Birmingham Folio is a manuscript of portions of the Quran that was discovered just a few years ago and is carbon dated to between 568 and 645 AD. When it came out a few years ago, I received several emails from people saying, well, now your book has been destroyed. You have to retract and apologize for did Muhammad exist, because this proves that Muhammad existed and the Quran existed early on, just as Islamic tradition says. And that was indeed how it was advertised. We have, for example, numerous news stories just from a few years ago saying this could have been the copy of the Quran that Muhammad himself owned. This could have been the copy that he himself dictated. This could have been the original Uthmanic Quran. Tremendous excitement about it. But if you stop and think about it, 568 to 645, Muhammad was born in 570, according to Islamic tradition, and died in 632, and started getting the revelations of the Quran in 610. So how is it that you have a possible Quran manuscript dating from between 568 and 610 before there was a Quran?
Yeah.
And so I thought, this doesn't refute my book. This proves my point, that this is an indication of what Luxemburg and Lulling and others have shown, that the Quran is made up of existing material that was adapted.
Yeah.
Of course, many people may not be aware that Arabic alphabet has numerous letters that are exactly the same as other letters, except for the diacritical marks, that is, dots below and above them. And the earliest Quran manuscripts do not have any of these diacritical marks. So Luxemburg and Lulling, in different ways, have gone back and read those as Aramaic texts rather than Arabic texts, finding that actually a lot of the Quran that doesn't make sense suddenly starts to make sense when you read it in Aramaic, and as Jay said, becomes clear as a Christian text. So this Birmingham Folio appears to have been most likely one of the source materials that the Quran was taken from. And it doesn't prove anything at all, except that the material that made up the Quran was circulating before the Quran itself.
You know that, Robert, actually, we're talking about only 33 verses. 33
Yes.
verses from chapter 18, chapter 19, and chapter 20. There are 343 verses in those three chapters. There are 6,326 verses in the entire Quran. If people are saying this is the Quran, 33 verses, but take a look at those 33 verses. In chapter 18, you have the seven sleepers of Ephesus. That has nothing to do with Islam. That was written in 521 AD. So that predates Muhammad. That predates the Quran. That predates Islam. The chapter 19 talks about the proto-evangelion of James. That comes from 145 AD. That's the 2nd century. Again, predates all Islam, Quran, and Muhammad. And then chapter 20, there's 40 verses there. The majority of the verses are chapter 20, the story of Moses that is comes straight out of the Bible, which is from the 15th century BC. Now, if you are borrowing, and you know the Quran is borrowed, most everything in the Quran is borrowed, all the poetry is borrowed, you have to, if it's borrowed, that means that which exists precedes it, right? That which you're borrowing has to come before it. So why are we surprised if these dates, 525, 521, 146, and 15th century BC, of course, predated? And obviously, they would have been written in Arabic. But notice this. Take a look at what they include. They include the Alaf Maksura. They include the Tar Marbuta. They include the definite article. Those do not exist in the Arabic that was in what we know as the Hijaz, Sabaic Arabic. The Sabaic Arabic that would have been in the place of Mecca, Medina, if Muhammad had written these or even received them, these didn't exist in that Arabic. So that also proves that even that what they borrowed was from much further north, way up in Jordan and Syria. Okay. And this is Nabatean Arabic.
Yep. So actually, it was the Birmingham Folio, in large part, made me think I need to do a revised edition of Did Muhammad Exist?
Robert, what I love about what you have done is you are actually pushing the envelope on almost every area. You're pushing the envelope on Muhammad. You're pushing the envelope on the Quran. You talk about the Qira'at. You introduce these from the 8th century, which has caused a huge furore because of that interview between Yasser Qadhi and Muhammad Hijab back in 2020. And you've also are introducing material on Mecca. And so almost what you're doing, you're hitting three things simultaneously. I call them the book, the man, and the place. The book, the Quran, the man, Muhammad, in the place, Mecca. Those three things, if you can shut down or even question or bring into light a problem, historical anachronisms with those three, just one would eradicate Islam historically. And you're doing that, but much more in this book. That's why I say to everybody, buy this book. Now, let me tell you, and this, I want to read out what other people have said, because people are actually acknowledging this. This is from Nur bin Laden, who is a writer and advocate dedicated to defending freedom and those threatened by the adherence of oppressive ideology.
Osama bin Laden's niece.
So the bin Laden is intentional. Okay, so you've got the niece of bin Laden, and this is what she says. As always, Robert Spencer dares to go where almost no one does, and this book is no exception. Why are so few asking these essential questions with regards to Islam's inception? The answer becomes evident as you read this fascinating, well-researched book, which in turn raises an abysmal question. Could it be that the past 1,400 years were based on a mirage? Woo, that's a mouthful. Commendations to you. Look at Bruce Thornton, research fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute, professor of classic and humanities at California State University. This is what he says. Spencer's careful, detailed, well-reasoned survey and analysis of the historical evidence offers strong evidence that the Muhammad and Islam itself were post-facto creations of Arab conquerors who needed a political theology delivered by a warrior prophet in order to unify the vast territories and diverse religious and ethnic groups now subjected to Muslim power, and to provide a potent basis for loyalty to their new overlords. The great service Spencer provides goes beyond popularizing the critical study of one of the world's largest religions in order to advance our knowledge and establish historical reality at a time when the threat of jihadist violence has silenced many people and intimidated them into voluntarily surrendering their right to free speech and the pursuit of truth. Spencer's brave book also demonstrates the importance of those quintessential and powerful Western ideals. Bless you. What a great commendation he's giving you. And you're doing something, and he's saying something here that needs to be really underlined. You are daring to go where others don't, where others won't, where others can't. You are picking up the mantle and saying, I'm going to say it. I'm going to be vilified for it. I'm going to be attacked. You've been harassed. They've also attempted your life there in Texas. They were out to kill you when they got killed themselves. So this is something that you have dared to do. That's why in some ways we see all of us look at you as a hero, because you've written so much that nobody dares write. And I know you're a humble man. You don't like to accept it. And I know you're probably squirming in your seat because that's typical of you. But let me say that, because those of us who are coming behind you, those of us who are using your books, those of us who are quoting, it's this kind of book we need. Because what you have done is you have gone back to the sources that are important. You have lifted them out, and then you've actually unpacked it. And then you say, now you deal with it. You're going to have to take and interpret what these sources say. You don't demand that they interpret the way you do. You put it out there and let them come to their own conclusions. You do come to conclusions, which is good, because a lot of people don't want to come to conclusions. You dare to do that. But not all of us have to do that. And for those who are watching this right now, and those of you who are going to be probably incensed or probably angered that a new edition yet has come out, I want you to comment in the comments below. Tell us what you don't like about this. Read the book first, though. Get the book. It's on Amazon. You can get it today. As of today, you can get this book, Did Muhammad Exist by Robert Spencer. I don't know what the cost is right now. Do you know what it is?
$25.20 at Amazon, $9.99 Kindle.
Okay, $25 for the hard copy. Is there a paperback or not?
Not yet. There will be later probably, but it's going to be a year or so.
Okay, get the hardback, because you need to read it. You need to use it, because this is foundational for everything you're going to be hearing all of us saying. And in some ways, we're letting Robert do the writing and get all the hassle and harassment and everything else. Also, he gets the profit. But certainly what we do want to make sure is that this is revised year after year after year, just because you're really hitting something, you might say, a dearth of understanding. People just don't understand when you say a question like, did Muhammad exist? Did the Quran exist? Did Mecca exist? And yet we have to say that. And it's great that you've got it in a book form so people can underline it. They can go and confront their Muslim friends with it, or ask them questions about it, or just bringing it up in a discussion. And please, you discuss as well. Both Robert and I will be looking at the comments. We'll try to respond to them. We will probably have to do some subsequent answering questions. So throw questions to Robert, but please read the book first. Read the book first, and then come back with your questions. We will promise that we will come up with subsequent episodes to answer those questions, because I'm sure a lot are going to come out. And the great thing about it, you're also going to be helping the two of us understand where we need to go with this material, where the weaknesses are, where our strengths are. Tell us where the strengths are and tell us where the weaknesses are, but do respond, because that's where we get the interplay. And that's where we get critiqued. And that's where we get peer reviewed.
Just saying, read the book first is key in what you're saying. Recently, I've been spending a little time jousting on Twitter with people about the book, and several Muslims have come up and said, of course Muhammad existed. Look at the Doctrina Jacobi, look at Sebeos, these things that you mentioned before that are all discussed in the book. And so they just assume that I'm ignorant of these things or ignoring them. All of the early mentions of Muhammad, or what are purported to be early mentions of Muhammad, every last one of them is discussed in this book and explained and evaluated in light of the claims made for Muhammad's life and career. And so read the book, and then I'd be very happy to discuss any aspects of it with you. But if you come at me making it very clear that you don't even know what case is being made, then it's hard to respond.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, you have it, everybody. Get the book, read it, and respond. Get it, read it, respond, so that we can then have this discussion. And we call that peer review. In some ways, YouTube is brilliant because you can get peer reviewed within minutes. Well, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope it happens within days, because it's going to take at least a day or two to read the book. It's 250 pages, so you can probably read it within a day or two. And underline it, put your questions in the margins. come back with us on it, get them into the comments, and we promise we will respond to the questions that are actually engaging with the material in the book. And that's where we go from there, because then we learn and you learn, and that way it helps us to make sure that the next edition comes out even better. Back to you then, Robert. What's the last thing you want to say as we close out this session?
Stop being paralyzed by fear. The world is so paralyzed by fear. The academic world, the political world, individuals, they think if we talk about this, we'll get killed. Well, you know what? You're going to die anyway. And so isn't it better to, as Sharb, the editor of Charlie Hebdo, who was killed in 2015, said, I'd rather die standing up than live on my knees. And let's go where the truth takes us. And that is beneficial in itself and makes life worth living. It's better to live with the truth than to die with the truth, rather, than to live 100 years as a coward.
Yeah, amen. Well done. And you are anything but a coward. And so we respect you. Thank you for doing this. God bless you. It's great that you're willing to actually put pen to paper, put it down there so we can read it, understand it, have it as a resource for the rest of us so that we can discuss it with others. God bless you. It's great to have you. We'll have you back again as soon as we start getting responses. This is Robert and Jay, over and out.